Hello and welcome to a Talmud Israeli production. Today we will review the highlights of this week's course of Daf Yomi study, Masechet Eruvin, pages 98 through 104, Tzadichet through Kuf Daled, 98. The topic at hand is when someone is reading a holy book, a sacred scroll, one of the 24 books of the Tanakh, and is sitting on a stoop, whether in a private area or a semi-private area, and they drop one end of the scroll and it rolls into the public domain. The question is, can you roll it back up so as to avoid disgrace for the sacred scroll? And there is a machloket Tanaim as about what extent you're allowed to do this, with some saying you have to not roll it back up, but rather hofchol aktav, flip it over so that the written side of the parchment is not facing the public, but rather is covered. Rabbi Shimon, however, takes a much more lenient approach in that he wants to rescue holy writings from disgrace. Rabbi Shimon Omer, kol davar shehu mishum shvut, anything which is only rabbinically prohibited, eino omed b'fnei kitvei HaKodesh, does not stand in the way of rescuing a holy book from a disgraceful situation. So he would allow rolling back up the parchment under all circumstances. Tzadi Tet, 99. The Mishnah tells us, a person should not stand in the private domain and drink in the public domain, or vice versa, unless his head and the majority of his body is extended over the threshold and into the domain in which he is drinking. What is the reason for this? Rashi explains, we don't want you to just extend your neck over the line, separating the domains, and drink, because we're afraid if you only have your neck and your head in the other domain where you're drinking, you might be tempted to move backward and bring the vessel with you and have the vessel cross from one domain to the other. So rather, what must you do? You must extend the bulk of your body into the domain in which you are drinking. Daf Kuf, 100. Asur la'adam shehalech al gabei asavim b'Shabbat. A person is forbidden to walk on grass on Shabbat. This was an Amoraic statement. In fact, there is a machloket Tanaim, a Tanaitic dispute, with one Baraita saying you are allowed to walk on grass, and one Baraita saying you're not allowed to walk on grass. And the Gemara wants to resolve this contradiction. Are you or are you not? How do we resolve these seemingly contradictory Braitaot? So the Gemara says, lo kasha, not a problem. Ha balachim, ha b'yaveshim. That there's a difference between wet grass and dry grass. As Rashi explains, wet grass would be a problem to walk on because if you were to detach it with your foot, you'd be guilty of tolesh. However, dry grass is considered kitzlushin dami. It's like it's already detached because it's dead. And so there's no problem walking on the dry grass. Another explanation, alternatively, ha desayim mesane, had lo sayim mesane. It depends if you're wearing shoes. If you're wearing shoes, you can't do it. If you're not wearing shoes, you can walk on the grass. Alternatively, everyone agrees you can walk with shoes, but the difference is whether the shoes have spikes. Ha de itle ukti, ha de letle ukti. If it has spikes, which are likely to uproot petals of grass, then you cannot do it. If the shoe doesn't have spikes, then it's not a problem. However, the Gemara concludes, V'ha'idna, nowadays, the Kamalan ka Rabbi Shimon, that we hold halachically along the lines of Rabbi Shimon, that says, Davar she'enu mitkaven is mutar, that whatever is not intentional is permitted. Kulu shari, you're allowed to walk on grass without any hesitation. 101, Kuf Aleph. Amar Rabbi Yochanan. Yerushalayim, as for the city of Jerusalem, ilmalei daltotan lo balayla, if it were not for the fact that the city gates are shut at night, you'd be liable for carrying in Yerushalayim on account of it being a public domain. So what the Gemara is actually telling us is that in fact you are not liable for carrying in Jerusalem because in fact it is not a public domain because its gates are closed at night. Well, how does the closing of gates at night render something less than a public domain? Rashi explains, because it's not like the Diglei Midbar. It's not like the encampment in the desert. The encampment in the desert of the Israelites in the days of the Midbar was Patuach Kol Sha'ah. It was open 24 hours a day. So if a city gate is closed at night and so you can't get in and out, it's not like the encampment of our ancestors in the wilderness and thus is not biblically a Reshut HaRabim. 102, Kuf Bet. The Mishnah tells us, Koshim ne'mab mikdash v'lo b'medina. They would tie a string if there was a string instrument in the orchestra of the Beit HaMikdash that needed to be fixed, that one of the strings was snapped and needed to be tied back together. You could do so in the temple, but not in the provinces. V'im betchila kan v'kan asur. But as for putting it into the instrument in the first place, a new string, that's forbidden whether in the temple or in the provinces. So the Gemara asks the question, Ura minhu, nemat kinosh nifseka lo hayakshra l'nonva. That if the temple, if the harp in the temple had a string that ripped, they would not tie a knot, but rather they would make a bow. So are you allowed to make a knot, or must you only make a bow? The Gemara responds, Lo kasha, not a problem. Harabban Rabbi Eliezer, that the lean position is that of Rabbi Eliezer, who says machshirei mitzvah, that preparatory acts to fulfillment of a mitzvah are overriding the Shabbat. However, the rabbis who don't hold that, who say machshirei mitzvah do not override the Shabbat, they would not allow one to tie the knot. They would only allow the making of a bow. 103 Kuf Gimel. Meshashlut Pesach latanur im chashecha. There is a general rule that you're not allowed to put things in an oven just before Shabbat begins, because we're afraid you're going to stoke the coals to cook the item so that it'll be ready quickly for the Friday night dinner. This rule is waived in the circumstance of the Korban Pesach, that you're allowed to put the Korban Pesach into the oven just before Shabbat begins, because Shvut Lamikdash Midin al Gazun Shmeichatel Bagechalim Bnei Chaburin Zrizin Hein, that we're not concerned that the people participating in the Paschal lamb are going to violate the rules of Shabbat by stoking the coals. Rather, we assume those who participate in the Chabura in this group are careful about their behaviors, and thus we can relax the rabbinic legislation in this one instance. Kuf Daled, 103. If you're guarding your fruits because of birds out in the field, or your gourds from the wild animals, you're allowed to function in an ordinary way. However, there are some caveats. You're not allowed to clap your hands and stomp your feet and dance around to ward off the animals as you would do on a weekday. So why are these various gesticulations forbidden on Shabbat? The Gemara asks, my timer, and it assumes, is it because you're making noise? Molid kala, you're producing sound, and producing sound is forbidden. And Rav Acha Bar Yaakov responds, no, that's not the reason why. The reason why is because Gezerah Shemini told Tzror, we're afraid if you were to do that, you'll also pick up a rock and throw it at the bird or at the animal. And picking up a rock and throwing it on Shabbat would be a grievous violation. So therefore, don't do any of these various gesticulations. Just stand there watching, trying to ward off the animals. Everyone have a great week.